Welcome to another virtual author chat at the Poison Pen Bookstore. I'm John Charles, and today the Poison Pen is delighted to have with us as our special guest author, Jennifer Robson, whose new book, Coronation Street, has just been published this month, and it's fabulous. Before we begin our chat, I'd like to let those listening in know the Poison Pen does have copies of Jennifer's new book, as well as her previous historical novels. And if you'd like one, we can put one on hold for you or put it in the mail. Just give us a call or go online to the Poison Pen Bookstore, and we would be happy to connect you with these truly fabulous historical novels. And now I'd like to welcome Jennifer.
Thank you so much. I wish I were actually in Arizona with you again. It's a pretty chilly day here in Toronto, but this
Oh,
is
yeah, now's the time to be in Arizona.
absolutely.
Let's start by talking a little bit about Jennifer before you were a writer. I almost feel like you were destined to write historical fiction, but you wanted to teach history. Is that
Well,
correct?
it took me a long time to figure out. As an undergraduate, I studied. I started thinking I would end up teaching English. That's what I thought I wanted to do, and then I just had an absolutely kind of life changing teacher in first year university. Wonderful man named Paul Webb, and I walked out of my first lecture with him thinking, "Oh yeah, I think it's going to be history." He just had that profound an effect on me, and it wasn't as if history wasn't, kind of in the air at home. My dad taught history. He was a university professor for gosh, like my entire life, and he only retired not so long ago, um, and. Uh, and so it was, a topic at the dinner table. We really, we would, it wasn't so rarefied as all of that. But if we had a question about something, we would ask either one of my parents, and they always had kind of long, interesting answers. And especially my dad, you could ask him anything about the First World War, the Second World War. Those were his areas of expertise. But I kind of resisted going down the history route, and that misguided and feeling the of having to be independent when you're in your teens, and but I had to kind of eat my words, because as of basically the first week and undergrad, I realized, oh, that's okay. History is it. And so from then on, I really was fairly single-minded in pursuing, getting doing as well as I could as an undergraduate, so that I, would have a chance at winning a scholarship to Oxford. From the beginning, that's where I wanted to go.
Yeah.
And my dad had gone there, and I think, I was kind of captivated by the kind of the romanticism of the idea of going to the University of the Dreaming Spires, and I was fortunate enough. I won a Commonwealth scholarship, which gave me kind of 3 full years of funding, and then I got another doctoral fellowship. So I got, I was able to study there and get my doctorate in history without, accumulating an absolute ton of debt, which, is a real blessing. Um, but then I finished, and there were no jobs there. I mean, there's still very few jobs. University history departments have been contracting for years, and if they're going to hire anyone new, they're not going to hire a European specialist. Um, they're going to hire somebody with, whose specialty is in what might have once been called area studies, but really is anywhere outside of Western Europe and North America, which
Mhm.
rightly so.
Yeah.
Um, and so I became a journalist for a number of years, and I was an editor, and I was at home with my kids when they were little. They're now almost 19 and 16. But when my daughter was a newborn and her brother is about 2.5, um, it just suddenly hit me that I didn't love. Yeah, I had kept working when they were little as a freelance editor. No, I didn't love it, and I wasn't. I was an okay editor. I was never as good at it as I would have been if I'd loved it. I think of the editors I work with on my books who are spectacularly talented, and I was not. And it just started hitting me that I really needed to do something with my life, and not with the idea of fame and fortune. It was simply it was mainly that I wanted to do something interesting that I found interesting and captivating. Um, but also I wanted my kids to be proud of me.
Yeah.
And not in the sense of, oh, look, my mom is successful. It just that I wanted them, and particularly my daughter, to see me doing work that I thought was important and interesting. Um, just to set an example for them. And so that's when I started writing my first book, which of course, like, most first novels takes a while to get published. And then, I still think of it as a series of exceptionally fortunate circumstances that led to my having it published and it doing well rather than sinking without a trace, because I mean it just the book business is a hard one to
Correct.
kind of to stand out from
Yeah.
the crowd. What I had going for me is that my book was on a came out, and the reason it was picked up for publication is because Downton Abbey had made
Mhm.
um, everything kind of Edwardian and First World War, fashionable or interesting,
Mhm.
kind of buzzy. And I had a manuscript that was pretty close to being ready to go. And so my first book, Somewhere in France, was one of the first books that, pieces of kind of recent works of historical fiction that focused on the Great War. And then from there, I dare say, it's not been easy. No, no job worth doing is easy. But I think I've had a pretty, I've again been very fortunate, and I have a lot of like there's some really lovely people who read my books, and whenever I'm having a bad moment, they magically seem to send me little messages that make me feel better and help keep me going. And it's as gigs go, it's a pretty awesome job, I must say. Yeah.
It has its advantages, but it is hard work, as you rightly, it's not easy being an author. Your first book was Somewhere in France. That kind of, did you know from that point on that you were always going to focus on kind of that before World War I, during between the wars,
Yeah.
after that was your kind of niche or niche?
Yeah, I mean, excuse me. That's when I'd studied the history. So broadly speaking, without getting into the weeds about what I did in my doctoral thesis, which just puts people to sleep. But my focus had always been as an historian, the history of Great Britain in the first half of the 20th century, and really, in a more focused way, the history of the First World War, interwar period, Second War period, and post-war period. So really going up to about 1900, 1960 roughly. And that I feel a comfort there in sticking to that period, because my background knowledge of the history is, I'm certainly not a world-class expert. I know enough of it I could teach it. And I just enough of it is kind of sunk in over the years, that there are a lot of things I can kind of write about without reflexively having to stop and go, oh, I don't know the answer. I usually have a pretty good idea and I can keep going, as
Mhm.
opposed to if I were to just pick up and study, start studying, say, um, you know, the history of like early Canada in the 18th century, when we really had the first kind of wave of European settlers coming in. I would I really have no more specific knowledge of that than your average person finishing high school these days, in Canada. So I would have to go back and start from scratch. Um, and or well, bluff, but I would rather not bluff my way through. I'd rather really
Yeah.
know this. Yeah,
Sometimes you always get, it seems you always get caught as an author when you try to bluff something. There's always someone out
yeah.
there that's gonna, especially with the internet.
Oh yeah, yeah. And I think also my default assumption is that the people writing or reading my books are smart people.
Mhm.
And if I'm lazy, they'll figure it out. Like I'll get emails from people. And so, and ultimately too, I think my dad's going to read what I write. The history professors that I studied under will read it. I don't want, I don't want to get things wrong.
You can be proud of your books. Yeah.
Yeah, and not least because they're, because the newer ones, the ones set in World War II and post-war period, there's still a reasonable number of people who are alive and lived through that time, and they will know. And I'm, to a degree, I'm writing these stories in homage to that, what's been called the greatest generation. I really do have such an admiration for the people, like my grandparents, for example, who lived through the war and had a really, really hard time of it, and had really very few supports in terms of what we would now consider as a given, right? That if you're struggling, with your mental health
Yeah.
after something, there are places to go.
Resources.
There are resources, and really after the war, there's just nothing. And certainly during as well, you just had to kind of um, keep calm and carry on, as it were. And so, it's an example of kind of a societal or society-wide example of people stepping up to the plate and doing the right thing. It's not universal. There's certainly plenty of people buying things from the black market, and plenty of people not doing their bit and not, making sure there are fair shares for everyone. But by and large, the average person really did behave in a really unselfish way. And I look at the recent pandemic, and for all that it's easy to focus on,
Yeah.
people, some people, those rare examples of truly shocking behavior and selfishness, by and large, most of us we just did our best, and we supported our neighbors. And, you know, um, whether or not in the fullness of time and the historical record, we'll discover whether we did the right thing or not. In some ways, that's beside the point. I think we just, again, we look to the collective good. I get choked up thinking about, remember when the Queen did her speech
Oh, yeah. Mhm.
during the pandemic, and this is a woman who had lived through the Second World War,
Mhm.
who had lost people that she cared about,
Mhm.
and I'm sure spent much of the war in a kind of mild state of anxiety, thinking about Prince Philip, who they weren't sweethearts or anything at that stage, but I think she had set her sights on him when you know uh, well before they
Mhm.
were officially connected, and knowing he was out as a naval officer in constant danger must have been terrible.
Mhm.
And the point at the end of the speech where she says, we will be together again. And I remember just sitting, listening and just crying and crying and crying. And at that point, I think I had not seen my sister, who lives in Toronto, normally 20 minutes away from me. I had not been in the same room as her for probably something like 6 to 8 months,
Mhm.
and certainly not been able to hug her. And that's a very small instance of, again, in the grand scheme of things, compared to what a lot of people went through, is nothing. But it is that there was that kind of that moment,
Mhm.
um, especially, and I was writing Coronation Year towards even kind of the tail end of when things were really grim, and certainly in Toronto we had a lot of very extensive and prolonged lockdowns, and I really did. It was not, actually, but it was not that hard to get into the wartime spirit, as it were. As we were kind of figuring out how to, we were, we went nuts in a vegetable garden that first summer, because, like, what else do we have to do? We weren't going anywhere. We were all four of us were stuck at home, and we grew some very expensive tomatoes. Let's put it that way. Far more expensive than you get in the grocery store.
Let's talk a little bit about your new book, Coronation Year. What can you tell readers about it?
Oh, so I start with, and I just have to say, I love, love, love this cover. I love the picture of the Queen. I mean, that cheeky grin, which you didn't see from her often, but it always told me that there was a really interesting lady behind the very disciplined kind of
Figure.
exterior. It also, you can see how beautiful she is. I mean, she really was very, very beautiful.
Mm,
And then they put the gold foil on, which I just love.
mhm.
Um, so coronation year started with a question that I asked myself, which was I was just struck by was thinking that I wanted to set a book again even farther into the post-war period. The gown was set in 1947, and I do like the idea of attaching books to these royal events, not because there's they're in a slavish kind of you know um, uh,
Gimmick or
uh,
something.
you know, recitation of minutiae of the royal lives. And in fact, the royals are really play walk-on parts, if at all. But they're great as backdrops or to what ordinary people are living through. And in this case, I just had this vision of, and in some ways, it's kind of mirrored by the cover of the book, which is a view of the Queen in the Gold State
Coach.
Coach. Um, to have been somebody who saw her go by, to be standing on the pavement at the side of the road in London with the crowds 10 deep, people had been there all night, and to catch a glimpse of her um, that day. And what would it have been like? And what would the significance have been to that person that I was just starting to imagine? And would it be possible for something like, the procession going by to affect them more than just on a transient in way? Like, could it actually have a real effect on their life? And so then that just led me down kind of the successive rabbit holes of where was the procession. There I was familiar with the idea of there really, as long as there have been coronations, there have been processions of one kind or another. Obviously the Gold State Coach only dates to the middle of the 18th century, um uh you still had kings and queens processing. Often it would be on foot or carried in a litter through the streets of London, so their people could see them, and they could be acknowledged by the people. It was almost in some ways as important as the coronation itself. And so I thought, well, okay, and I had again enough of an awareness. Oh, I remembered that the procession, both before and after the coronation, were very long, and I remembered hearing the Queen when she talked about her coronation, and I think that was at her Diamond Jubilee. Um, and she wasn't interviewed, but she agreed to reminisce on camera without being asked direct questions. And she did say that it was horrendously uncomfortable, the gold coach. It was just, and then that, and you've got the crown, and it was kind of, as wonderful as the day was, it was very uncomfortable. And um and so I had an awareness of the importance of this procession. But then when I started thinking, well, what where would I set the book, and have the coronation as a backdrop? And I didn't want to go inside the palace walls. And I entertained the thought of going back to Norman Hartnell's salon for about 5 minutes. And then I thought, no, I'd be just, I'd just be doing a copy of the gown if I wrote something that focused on Hartnell, as interesting as I found his work, and the lives of the people kind of behind the scenes. Um, and then I just thought, well, people were coming to London, they needed places to stay. It all kind of came in a little cascade. There are all these, the big famous hotels, the Savoy, Claridge's, and so on. Well, what about the little hotels that don't really get written up, or if they're in the guidebook, there's a one sentence mention of them, clean and economical, that kind of thing. And I thought, what about a little place like that's been around forever, but it's somehow it just barely managed to kind of stay afloat? And what if it's on the parade route? And what if the chance of, and this is something I just read incidentally, which that the hotel prices went through the roof and people were charging absolute extortionate fees to have a view, even if you weren't a hotel, if it was just an office and you had a view on the coronation procession going by. People were charging hundreds of pounds. And I thought, well, what if the hotel is run by someone who, isn't interested in charging hundreds and hundreds of pounds. She's just interested in earning enough to keep this little family business afloat.
Mhm.
And then that's when I found the character Edie, who is, of the three central characters, the one that I think in some ways is kind of the connective, she's the connection between everyone in the book. She holds the book together. Um, and then from there, once I had Edie, and then I started realizing what the hotel would be and where it would be, and then the other characters started to pop into place, and with me, plotting is just it's almost the last element. The characters come first, and then once they're pretty clear in my mind, then I started thinking of what things can happen to them. Sometimes it's terrible things, and I feel awful about it.
Yeah. Mhm.
And I've, in previous books, I've killed off the occasional characters and felt terrible, very, very guilty. And But in this one, it gets so it's more really. I wanted it to be a character study of, again, these people doing their best in the post-war period, where life was, increasingly hopeful. Things were, you know, the prospects for tomorrow seemed better than they were for that day, for the first time in a long time. And people could look to the future and feel a sense of hope and anticipation, optimism, which had not been the case for, like 15 years, or at least beforehand.
I think
Um,
that's fascinating because one of the things that I discovered through your books was there's always, I guess, kind of this idea that World War II ended and everything was back to normal and the world was bright and beautiful and it was
yeah,
go, go, go.
yeah.
But for Great Britain, it was still rationing and struggling. And in
Oh,
fact, you'd
yeah.
written something, yeah, you had written something somewhere else that I thought was very moving. You said there was this long period of people effectively being on their knees. That first step when you're trying to heave yourself onto your feet again is sometimes the hardest step. And I wanted to capture that year. That's
Yeah.
so beautifully written.
Oh, thank you. Well, it was, and again, it's easy, and especially for those of us living in North America, where life returned kind of to normal, and in fact, the post-war period of prosperity happened very quickly. And so certainly, people, when we're thinking of, say, the late 1940s, early 1950s, from an American or Canadian perspective, it's definitely a sunnier kind of version, because that's that period that you have, this kind of golden period before the Cold War starts, or
Mhm,
or well, it had started, but before people were aware of it, largely speaking.
mhm,
And whereas in Britain, things just were very, very grim. And interestingly, even though things were still on the up and up in the early 1950s, I mean, my parents uh, were university students, and were married in 1965, and then we're in England for a number of years after that, as my dad finished his own academic, like his doctoral work, and their memories were of Britain, and this is at this point in the mid to late 60s, where things again were, the rationing was done with, but the luxuries of life were few and far between compared to the standard of living that most of us enjoy today without even thinking about it.
mhm.
And it was just, people had learned to do without. And again, and this is something I even noticed living in England in the early 1990s, when I was a graduate student in England. Um, you could still very easily walk around parts of London, not the kind of posh neighborhoods in
Mhm.
central London, but any number of the outlying suburbs, and certainly in the East End, and you could routinely walk past buildings that had been blitzed and had not been rebuilt. We're talking 30, 40 years after the fact. Um, I just thought that was incredible. I'd never expected it, but there were still building sites that were effectively rubble. and nothing had been built on top of them. Now that is all gone. I mean, London,
Yeah.
there was a
Boom.
real building boom,
Yeah.
and so you'd be lucky to find a square centimeter these days that is not spoken for. But the fact that kind of you know what my characters see in Coronation Year in terms of the hoardings that alongside um, the sidewalk, where now today we would see the hoardings and assume that something's being built there,
Mhm.
that there's cranes and so on. Then it was just to stop people from falling into like an open pit
Pin.
of rubble, right? And to make the street look a little more attractive. But it was everywhere. It was all over London.
Yeah.
And the fact that what my characters saw in 1953 in some ways like that had not disappeared decades later. And that speaks to really the absolute destruction of the British economy. Insofar as in waging the war. Yes, they won the war, but uh, there was just the treasury was empty. It was empty. Which then begs the question. I find it interesting is they did manage to put on a really good show for the 53 coronation. They did far more to prepare for that coronation than is being done for this one, which of course reflects the king's wishes absolutely, both in terms of wanting to be economical and environmentally conscious. And and there is I think everyone can see there's a real cost of living crisis going on in the UK. And so to spend tons and tons of money on street decorations is not something that's really very popular.
Yeah.
um, but it's interesting in some ways. You have in 1953 and again in 2023, so 70 years difference.
Mm.
The reasons for the kind of the malaise or the difficulties are profoundly different, but nonetheless you have both times a country that has really been struggling. And in 1953 it had been struggling. There was a feeling of resurgence that the coronation built upon. um, I don't think that feeling of resurgence is present in the UK in the moment. And so in terms of what it how does the coronation fit in with the prevailing mood, um, it remains to be seen. I think people right at the moment are not getting behind it,
Yeah.
the way certainly the way they're not doing it the way they did in 1953.
And Charles
Um,
is kind of problematic in his own right, just because of his association with Diana and
yeah,
all that.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Funnily
That's
enough, I wouldn't say I'm not rah-rah about the royals to begin with. I have some real ethical kind of dilemmas with the notion of an inherited monarchy that really lies in the hands of one family of white Christian people who don't you can't necessarily say that they reflect the reality of what an average British person or an average Canadian person, since the Queen or the King is the head of state in Canada. And so, setting all that aside, I do have real sympathy for the King in that, if we were all to be judged by our behavior in the lowest moment of our life, to be judged by that behavior decades later and perpetually, I think we would all find it hard to kind of be like, you want to
yeah.
say, but I've done a lot of good stuff since then, and I'm inclined to kind of try and give him a fair shake. And I think is the life he's led has not been easy in terms of perpetually being and waiting for your mother to die so you can have your job is fundamentally somewhat monstrous. I think just it's a monstrous expectation of any human being. Um, but I think his instincts in terms of preserving the really unique historic elements of the coronation while also not going overboard on extraneous costs. I think that's a sensible one. And to be honest, they already have all the stuff they need to put on a good show, right?
Yeah. Mhm.
They don't really, I mean, you've got the Gold State coach, check, sumptuous robes. Nobody needs anything new. They really don't.
The crown, yeah.
Billions of dollars, like, the crown jewels are valued conservatively in the billions, right? I mean,
Wow.
they're
Mm,
so, if you accumulate all of it together, like everything that's in the Tower of London, as it were, all of that, it's and in fact is priceless. I mean, these things are just beyond valuing. You have all that together, plus the music, the choir, the congregation. I mean, it's impossible to put on a bad show. There's just no way that they're going to make it look cheap and cheerful. It'll, it'll look fine. And even rain is not going to. I suspect it probably will rain. It did on the Queen's coronation,
mm.
and it didn't seem to affect people. But yeah, it's interesting. It's something that, I'm thinking about more than I ever would have thought possible, just because of the proximity of my book coming out and the actual coronation, which obviously we had
You
no
did
idea.
not plan. It was not, you
No, and I had
totally.
nothing to do with Her Majesty. I would much rather she was still with us. I have a real fondness for her. Again, it's not a completely unexamined thing, and that, I again do have my reservations about just the notion of something like a monarchy. At the same time, I could stand there and admire the Queen as a woman of absolute impeccable moral, fiber, and
Mm,
that she did a really hard and miserable and fairly lonely job, for more than 70 years, and really never once publicly complained
mhm.
about it. I mean, how many of us could do that? I think I would last a day. I would last a day of being, having people behave in that very deferential way, which is, I think it's got to be disconcerting.
You never
And
really know who your friends are, in a
you
sense.
never really know, and you've seen that, with the phone hacking scandals and so on, with the gutter press in UK, and that happened to the young princes, where they just didn't know if their friends were truly their friends, and all of that is just is terrible. And yeah, I just, I have real sympathies for them, and I have real sympathy for the Queen, who was never also, she was never she was not born into the position. She was born into roughly an approximate position that Princess Eugenie has today, in that she was the daughter of the second son, with no realistic prospects of ever becoming the monarch. She was just so far from the throne. And then in the matter of months, all of that was upended, and she became the heiress presumptive. Princess Margaret is, this is probably apocryphal, but it's one of these things that feels true. When the girls were told that their father was to become king, their uncle David was abdicating, and their father would become king. And then that, I'm not sure if it was then or later that they realized, oh, that means like Elizabeth is up next for the job. And Princess Margaret's response was to turn to her sister and say, "Oh, poor you,"
Mm.
like sympathetically, like, "Oh man, you really got stuck with it." And so, when she's either 9 or 10, or she would have been 10, um, to suddenly have this land, this is, your life has changed. There's no, opting out. There's no, oh no, I think I'd rather not.
Yeah.
That was it. That was it. That was her life. And to be perpetually set apart, to the point where, by the time that she passed away, there was no one left in her inner circle, uh, who could, with whom I think she could be completely natural,
Yeah.
and that she was not in a position of complete superiority. I mean, as long as her mother and sister were alive, and her husband, there were people who were, broadly speaking, her peers. I mean, she was always going to be, the alpha in the room, as it were.
Yeah.
But with them gone, and then her contemporaries, most of her close friends had passed away, and I think my heart kind of goes out to her in her later years. I think it must have been quite hard, and
Yeah.
but she also wasn't one to sit and feel sorry for herself. So
Yeah.
that's that wartime, character.
Mentality. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, for sure.
Now, I know you didn't want to do what they would say in the fashion trade, a knockoff of the gown with
Yeah.
Coronation
Mhm.
Year. But what I found fascinating, where there's kind of threads that pull the two books together, and one
Yeah.
was Norman, is it Norman Hartnell? Hartnell?
Yeah.
He designed both the gown for the wedding
Yeah.
and the coronation gown, and you put these fascinating little details in about how for the coronation gown it was based on the flora and fauna of.
Mhm. Well, and what Norman Hartnell wanted was, which I thought was very interesting. He did a number of designs that he presented to the Queen, and the one that she liked the best did have kind of the national floral emblems of each country that was part of Great Britain, but also the realms and territories over which she was monarch. So, for example, there was a maple leaf for Canada, and but then when and he'd done these beautiful draw, or rather probably Ian Thomas, who worked for him, who was a better draftsman, had done the drawings, and they were presented to the Queen, and he'd added in some color in the embroidery, so the gown itself is not just white. There's beautiful kind of pastels, and it really kind of glittered, and it was just a stunning gown. But then when it was presented, and I think it was probably, it might have been the Duke of Norfolk, who's the Earl Marshal who organized the whole thing. I can't remember exactly which official looked at it and said, "Oh, no, 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 no. You have daffodils here for Wales. No, no, you can't." And he was, "Well, what are you talking about? I mean," and he said, "No, no, the official emblem for Wales is the leek." And Norman Hartnell was horrified. I mean, the thought that like this beautiful gown was going to have vegetables, like like, and it would be right at the top at the front, and but and they every and I guess the Earl Marshal was, "No, no, 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 that is the only correct thing. If that's the design, you must have leeks, right?" And so he went, and I think he talks about going out to his own vegetable garden and kind of pulling up some leeks, and realizing that when they're kind of young plants, the same way chives, we use chives decoratively in gardens, and you can have quite a pretty flower, and then the leaves can kind of be splayed, almost like a stylized palm tree. And so that's what you see. But if you look very closely at the front of the Queen's coronation gown, it's leeks on the front, which I don't know if people realize, like, notice it. You certainly don't notice it. It's incorporated in a very subtle way, but she has vegetables on the front of her gown. Yeah, and I really just wanted. I love just digging into the kind of minutia of any kind of working environment. So with Hartnell Salon, the gown, I wanted to know what it was like to be an embroiderer, and with this book, I have Edie running the hotel, like very small, modest little hotel. But what is that like? I have Jamie, who's an artist, so I wanted to get a sense of the preparations an artist would would um, uh, would do while getting ready, to paint a large and very important commission. You
Yeah.
don't just kind of sit down and start drawing it. I mean, you have months and months, and all the great artists, in addition to the paintings they produce, have preparatory drawings and so on. And then there's Stella, who I really wanted to get a sense of what it was like to be a photojournalist. And that was actually a lot of fun to research, because my uncle John, his name is John Moyer, he's a very, very talented photographer who lives in West Vancouver. And I just thought, oh, I just went straight to him, because he's also done a lot of work as an historian, looking into, um, kind of the history of journalism and newspapers in British Columbia. And so he's only in his early 70s, but he certainly remembers his parents' work, as my grandparents were journalists. And so he was able to tell me all sorts of interesting things about types of cameras people were using, and how they would react to a low light setting, and how things that we that photographers will be using at the Coronation, for example, these compact zoom lenses.
Uh,
Um, insofar as they had some very primitive telephoto lenses, then they were enormous. It was like, I mean, they were practically the little, I wouldn't say the length of a car, but they were really enormous things that had to kind of sit on stands and so on. And now, the photographers in the Abbey on May 6th will have very small and obtrusive cameras. The technology has advanced so much, and they won't have to worry about the lighting at the same way that journalists did in 1953. So all of that was just
yes.
fascinating, and yeah, I loved and even things like how people watched it on TV, and getting the television installed, and what a monumental fuss that was. And all for something that had a screen, just a teeny weeny little screen, like, not much bigger than this.
The size of a
And one
microwave or something. Yeah.
yeah, and one channel. ITV didn't start in the UK for about I think another 5 or 6 years. So in 1953 is like the one channel, and the set things you could watch at such and such a time, and radio. You check it in Radio Times magazine, and but the Coronation, more than any other single event, um, for sure in Britain, but arguably also in North America, did more to popularize the kind of and build the medium of television than really any other single event of the time. The next closest thing in terms of people watching, um, really attentively on a worldwide scale. I don't know. I think it would probably the next thing you're looking at, or anything to do uh, with the uh, uh, with the NASA, the space program, and people watching
Mhm.
launches, possibly the news coverage and the footage when President Kennedy was assassinated, things like that. And but that's much farther into the 1950s, and so for early on in the world
Yeah.
of television, that's and I my parents, certainly the first time they watched anything on television was the Coronation.
Mhm. Before I forget, the hotel that you created in the book is fictional.
It is,
Uh,
yes. I
Someone has done some renderings of it. Is that correct?
Yes, so my friend, Charisma Panchapakasan, who's also I got to know Charisma. She and her husband are an amazingly talented team of architects, who, um, you conceived a kind of a new vision for our house in Toronto. And so last year we were out of our house. It was, the interior was redesigned very, very sensitively, because we love all the old parts of the house. We just wanted to kind of update it, but then still have it recognizably be 100-year-old house. And they did a beautiful job. And I got to know Charisma pretty well in that time, and discovered early on that she's also a very talented fine artist whose work is really sought after. And then I as I was working in the book, and I had this vision of the blue line in my head, but complete inability to translate that to anything other than just a written description. And so I approached her and said, do you think we could work together, and you could create an image of the blue lion for me? And because she's also an architect, she had all the tools she needed to kind of, help me bring this vision to life. And it was so much fun. I just had such a great time working with her. And I talk about it. There's an essay on my website called Finding the Blue Lion, and where I talk about kind of feeding all the information to Charisma, and then she put it together and then produced this from really the beginning. There was the blue line that had been inside my head all along. And so there is a building on the site that I describe, just on Northumberland Street, just off Northumberland Avenue, in Whitehall. There is a beautiful old pub there called the Sherlock Holmes. You can go in, have a yummy glass of beer, very nice sandwich. The building, in its broad, it kind of its outlines, its dimensions, is the same as the Blue Lion. But what I have done is kind of removed the Sherlock Holmes, whoop, and then put the Blue Lion on top. And so I hope people can suspend their disbelief, and just imagine that there's the blue line is hidden kind of behind this like magical veil, I suppose. And because the difference there is that the blue line, while the exterior looks fairly new, really only 150 years old. The interior, or what's hidden beneath, is actually an extremely ancient building that dates to, the 13th or 14th centuries. And is not that's not uncommon in London. You never know as you walk down the street how old the buildings are behind. A lot of them will have these relatively modern, and people, that's not being done now.
Mm.
But the Victorians and the Georgians were very fond of taking ancient buildings. And if it was cheaper to knock it down, they'd just knock it down. But if it was impractical, they would just put a new facade on. And so what would look to be a contemporary building, to people, say 100 years ago, then they would walk through the door and realize they're in a much older building. But I guess it was also the keeping up with the neighbors kind of thing.
Before we run out of time, and I can't believe how quickly it's flown by with you, I know Coronation Year is just out. Is there something in the works? Do you want to talk about what might be on the
Yeah,
horizon?
it's still such early days in that I kind of keep trying to kind of work away on it in between, talking about Coronation Year and running after my various animals and the teenage, a lot of corralling of animals and teenagers. And it will be set. It's rather than this very kind of compressed timeline that I have in Coronation Year, which is, effectively, it's
Months,
really
yeah.
more like 6 months
Mhm.
with an epilogue towards the end of the year, not giving anything away. Um, the next book is really the sweep of the 20th century. I've been really
Oh,
interested in kind of writing a book that just takes it all in. Um, and following one woman and her very long life through that century. And it's set in Britain, kind of my happy place.
mhm.
Much of it set in London, and and I'm still at that kind of period where I'm almost superstitious about talking
Same
about it
page.
until I've kind of ironed things out with my editor and my wonderful literary agent, just to make sure we're all on the same page. So yeah, we're as soon as I've got Coronation Year kind of safely launched into the world, then I'll dig back in and go back into my writer's cave.
Well, the good news is we can hope for something from you, which is always good
Yes,
news.
I guess it's 20, probably you'll be early 2025
Mm.
when the new one comes out. Yeah.
Now, how can readers learn more about your books? Are you on social media? Do you have a
Yes.
website?
So social media, it's author Jennifer Robson, all kind of squished together, and that's both Instagram and Facebook. And then my website is jennifer-robson.com, because there's another few Jennifer Robsons out there. Although if you just Google me, it'll pop up. And I've just finished populating the website with all sorts of kind of extra bonus material. So there's a lot of stuff there for book clubs. There are copies of Charisma's illustrations. There's some recipes, some suggestions if you want to hold a Coronation Year party for your book club, or even a Coronation Day party. We'll be adding some more there. Yeah, it's been a lot of fun putting together the information. Normally in my previous books there was a PS section,
Mm.
which would have essays and extras and so on. And there's a pretty dire paper shortage going
Yeah.
on, so one of the things that had to go, unfortunately, was the PS section within the book. But all the usual things that people would find in the book are all on my website now, so you can access them no matter what. And it's nice, and people who uh, listen on audiobook quite often don't get those PS materials, so now they're available to everyone.
That's great. This has just been a delight. The Poison Pen is so honored to have today our special guest author, Jennifer Robson, whose new book is Coronation Year. I'd like to thank Jennifer for joining us today, and thank those of you tuning in to another virtual author chat at the Poison Pen. Hope to see you next time.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jennifer.